Thank you very much, Mohammed, and welcome all of you here tonight. I'm especially honoured to be MC with distinguished guests whom Mohammed has introduced already, each expert in their own way and who will bring considerable weight and ideas to this discussion. I would like to ask everyone, though, to help make it a discussion, because I think this kind of format is ideal, because often we're asked to come to a long lecture. Sometimes, though, it's in questions after the lecture that the interesting part of the conversation ensues. And so it's the questions from you, with perhaps a comment on some aspect that you may have experienced in your different walks of life, which can then help clarify and elucidate, A, what the problem is. In the words of a famous television psychologist, Dr. Phil, you can't fix what you don't acknowledge. So first of all, we have to acknowledge, is there a problem? What is the problem? And what's the solution and rectification? Mohammed said that we all instantly accepted. Could I suggest it's very hard to refuse Mohammed and Forum Australia when they phone and make invitations. It's been very difficult in the past. The only way I've been able to do it in the past is when he's invited me and I haven't been in Canberra. I made the mistake of not being in Sydney tonight because although he introduced me as the Master of Ceremonies, MC, in my case, MC might stand for mildly confused. Could I just, perhaps to start with, and I acknowledge my colleague from the Interfaith Forum, Dr. Willie Sananeka, the Secretary, and others in this audience whom I've met before at other functions. I recognise a few of the faces. Of course, Shelley Sacker-Kelly, with Mike Kelly and Mr. Nick Marnicus, such an important role in multiculturalism in the ACT. Australia, of course, has a very mixed history, and I think we should start perhaps by acknowledging the ancient and original history of Australia with the Indigenous peoples. And I'd like to explain here that I differ a little bit in the acknowledgement to country, which I've often heard from members of the government in the ACT, when they acknowledge and welcome only the Ngunnawal people. There are in fact at least three groups that claim custodianship, and that's a very important word for people of faith, because the reality in theological religious terms, we think we may own something, but we're only here temporarily. We're only custodians. And those are the Ngunnawal people, the Ngambri, and the Ngarigo peoples. I like to acknowledge all three. There is a fourth group, because, not just to mention one, because I, as a non-Indigenous people, do not have the right to exclude other groups from acknowledging their ancestry in this land of now it's considered between 60 and 80,000 years. So I certainly acknowledge all the elders, past and present, and acknowledge their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. This ancient history of the Australian people, there wasn't always the same understanding. Last year, I was invited to appear before the Senate committee hearing on racial discrimination, and one of the coalition senators suggested to me that people choose to be a victim. I found this a difficult concept, and you won't be surprised that I argued against it. I don't think people choose to be a victim. And we must acknowledge that there were various forms of racism and prejudice which form a very dark chapter in Australian history. The last massacre of Aboriginal people took place in 1946 in West Australia, when women and children were killed. They didn't choose to be discriminated against. And I think we must bear that in mind when we talk about whatever racism or instances of injustice or insult. I've been called names by different people. It hasn't always been on the basis of my ethnic heritage, whatever. Sometimes people just have hatred in their heart. But there are other aspects to the Australia that I love, and that is in Australia, particularly between the years 1972 and 1996. And for those of you who weren't here in 1972, we had quite a marvellous Minister for Multicultural Affairs, Mr. Al Grasby, who pointed out that under the laws existing at the time, that is in the late 60s and early 70s, even Jesus would not have been admitted to the country because he was from the wrong area. So this is something we have to understand, but there was this wonderful period in Australia of acceptance, of integration, and I still remember the Australian family, the Farnhams, living in Marrickville in Sydney, who took my parents and myself under their wing, integrated us into Australian society. As I'm speaking to you, I have to point out that English was not my mother tongue. It was the fourth language I learned to read and write, and the fifth language I learned to speak. And as I said once to a university audience, I hope nevertheless you can understand me quite clearly. So it's not a question of where we come from, it's how we adapt, how we integrate. And the aspects of kindness and integration and democracy that my parents and so many other migrants have found in Australia as a haven, a safe harbour from persecution, from discrimination, in whatever countries they may have come from, to build a new life, in a democracy which has as its basis the Magna Carta and the constitutional rights in that. Although Australia differs in one important aspect, and in a forum I organised last year with Father Professor Frank Brennan, he pointed out that some of the politicians who were against a Bill of Rights in the Australian Constitution have now organised a committee to look at religious freedoms. That Bill of Rights would have ensured the religious freedoms. It's one of the contradictions, but we find contradictions in every society and in every parliament. So one of the particular aspects we find in Canberra, now the Australia that I grew up in, I went to primary school in the 1950s, and at that stage I can tell you there were deep divisions in Australian society, but not between people from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East and here. The difference was on the basis of religion. And children in the public school used to throw stones at children in the Catholic school. There was a deeply divided society on the basis of religion. But these days, this doesn't happen that way. We have all kinds of protections which some of our other speakers will mention. There is an important aspect though in Canberra. In Canberra Hospital, 70% of the patients do not want a chaplain from any religion. 70% of the magistrates who take an oath of office to be sworn in do not swear upon any religious text, Bible, Quran, but they take a vote of affirmation because they don't profess any religion, any faith. So if we have a society in Canberra where 70% of the population does not have an understanding of religion, how do we expect them to understand what is Islam, what is Judaism, what is Buddhism, what is Hinduism? It makes it more difficult. And I just wanted to give that context for what we're looking at in Canberra. And as one theologian and historian pointed out, people who don't understand other religions are unable to understand their own. Australians will buy hot cross buns without necessarily understanding the cultural and religious basis of that, or have a Christmas tree without understanding the same. So there are things embedded in the culture which aren't necessarily understood by everyone in the society. So I can say that perhaps if I give a parameter for your questions and myself before I hand over to the main speakers, I would say there are a number of aspects which we need to look at. First of all, what is a phobia and what is racism? Is there a difference? Well, phobia in broad sense is a fear, and racism is a prejudice, where people make a judgment not based on facts or education, but on ignorance. And unfortunately, ignorance tends to be widespread. There are many other aspects which we need to consider, and that is, for example, the role of social media, which a lecturer that's at St Mark's Institute of the Stuart Griffith University, Tony Hassan, calls anti-social media. And we have to look at the amount of abuse, the racism which is spread on social media. Have our laws kept up with that? The reason I mention that is because in my voluntary work in Canberra, two of the organisations I've been with, the Multicultural Community Forum, the chair for the last 5-6 years has been Diana Abdul Rahman, and she tells me about the kind of prejudice and racist statements which she sees on social media. And the other chair of the Canberra Interfaith Forum, Dean Sahu Khan. So I've been very honoured and pleased to work with those. In the role of media, in 2014, the Australian newspaper ran a headline, "We will fight Islam for 100 years." After that headline, an imam, a rabbi and a reverend went to the Lakemba Mosque with an alternative banner, "We will love Islam for 100 years." One has to look at the role of News Limited as an organisation, particularly in what it prints in the Daily Telegraph, as an incitement to hatred, to racism, to fear. You might remember a few election campaigns ago, one of the candidates in Western Sydney said the reason there were traffic jams on the freeways because the migrants and the asylum seekers were taking up all the space. This is no different from 40 years ago when my mother-in-law was told the reason there's a drought in a Victorian country town is because the migrants were drinking all the water. So we also have to look at the role of leadership. Where there is clear political leadership against racism, against phobias, there is less of it. One brief example, I was in charge of the first matriculation students sent from Malaysia and Indonesia to do the matriculation in New South Wales. Around about time, there was a Professor Geoffrey Blaney, who was chair, a patron of the Australia-China Society. And he came out in a statement, there are too many Asians in Australia. The way the Daily Telegraph printed it, I can tell you, from one day to the next, my students started to be spat on in the street. One day to the next. So leadership and media have an incredibly important role. We also have to spread the message to educate people about religions. And we have to invite the representatives of government to bring into government schools a subject which only the independent and Catholic schools have, religion and values education. Because my experience in teaching that at Canberra Grammar, the students come out with an understanding of all the religions and talk about the wisdom texts. And this wisdom is something which the majority of the population is not receiving. So with that brief introduction, I hope I haven't depressed you too much. I'll hand over to the speakers. I have to tell you, I had the reputation as a strict disciplinarian for people who don't obey the guidelines set by Helen and Muhammad Ali and all the staff of the Forum Australia, that this is a question and answer. So please try and refrain from doing what I've just done, making a long comment.